is Eternal King here, bringing you another LOR video today. I have actually been enjoying Eternal a fair bit since the Eddy counters have kind of come out. Because everybody's playing anti-tempo right now, Eternal's actually in a pretty decent place. You're not going to see as much Azir Aurelia, you're not going to see as much Eddy, you're not going to see as much aggro, simply because everybody is essentially, if you look at my last video, I talked about it, everyone's essentially on a tempo deck or an a temple deck, so they're running temple. They're running, essentially infinite cycling, and then they're just like chumping up the board, cycling, and then playing out. They're essentially just winning once you run out of steam. And the funny thing is that if you're a legacy LOR player, if everybody is playing anti-tempo, it's very easy for you to play control. Because the biggest difference between an anti-tempo deck in LOR and a properly constructed control deck is that a control deck can win regardless of sort of board state, right? You talk about Mogwai, if you know Mogwai, big card player, he used to talk a lot about archetypal mid-range in LOR. Like, what is mid-range in LOR? Why should you play mid-range? And that sort of thing. So there are reasons. There are reasons to go back to re-examine mid-range decks and re-examine kind of combo decks and different control decks when everyone's playing temple or anti-tempo. Again, I know the words sound very similar probably on this mic. I'm saying temple as in the 5-mana card and tempo as the gameplay concept where you essentially flood the board as quickly as possible with units. So if the best decks in Eternal were tempo decks, and then everybody went anti-tempo to counter the tempo decks, the best thing you can do is then switch to mid-range, control, or combo. And the nice thing about a deck like Jace Lux, when it's properly constructed to be archetypal mid-range, and I'm going to run through the deck construction process on how I took Jace Lux from like this sort of like 55% kind of garbage shell to like something that's actually worth playing. There are a lot of complex decision-making processes happening here that make this deck kind of just good into everything, right? If someone plays ramp, you're okay into ramp. If someone plays aggro, you're okay into aggro. If someone plays, anti-tempo, you're okay into anti-tempo. Like, this deck just kind of is okay into everything. That's the way that it's constructed, and I'm going to talk about the decisions that you need to make to take this deck from sort of like situational tier to, actually decent, right? Usually it's 55% in a situational tier, and then how do you take it into this particular Eternal meta and make it slightly better? Because Jace Lux is a fantastic deck. There's a lot of tech to choose from in terms of your card selections and how you play the deck. There's massive differences in the exact way that you do that. So first off, Ferris Financier. We don't need to explain why this card's in the deck. It is the best Jace Lux cycler. You run it in every Jace Lux deck because sometimes it just gets you an amazing card. You'll notice that we aren't running the 1-mana 2/1, and that's a deliberate choice. We are a mid-range deck. We don't need Forge Chief. We are more value greedy than Forge Chief. I find Forge Chief really devalues this deck a fair bit. So we're not running Forge Chief. I would rather be on Prototype Porobot. So Prototype Porobot, functioning similar to a Forge Chief, but it has last breath, so it can't die. You essentially get to summon out infinite Porobots to chump up the board. So it doesn't matter if the opponent plays a 10-10, you have Prototype Porobot, you block it, you get the attune, and then you get to resummon it for essentially for free. So always run Prototype Porobot in Jace Lux. I think it's probably the best newish, relative to Jace Lux, newish card that was introduced. I'm totally off of Forge Chief for Prototype Porobot most of the time. And then finally we have Mage Seeker Persuader. Again, classic Jace Lux tribal card, 6-mana spell casting tribal card that basically turns into a 4/3. And it turns out that a 4/3 just is pretty good at challenging a lot of things in the game. It kind of works out that way. That 4/3 is a magic number for you to be playing with 2 mana, right? Like a 2-mana 4/3 with Challenger is just kind of good. In a mid-range shell, if you just want to drag things, you need the cheap Challenger. It's going to get you there. Aftershock, total meta call. Like, I literally just made a video on how everyone's playing Temple, and then before everyone was playing Temple, everyone was playing Azir Aurelia. So like, whether someone's playing hardcore tempo or they're playing hardcore anti-tempo, Aftershock just happens to hit both of those two extremes very well. Probably better than Thermo, I would guess. Thermo being the other card that you could potentially use if you just feel like everyone's going big and that's it. You could potentially use Thermo. But Thermo also is an awkward card. Like it's hard to find a perfect time for Thermo sometimes. So usually you just take the Aftershock and then, bank on them sort of, potentially needing landmark removal. If you really want to, you could run Scholarly Pioneer instead of the Aftershock. Like that's fine. If that's really what you're going for. If you just find that you need more chumpers, more people to, more dudes to fill up the board, more challenging, that sort of thing. But Aftershock's also just kind of good. Like it just hits a lot of things, right? If someone plays a 2-mana ramp card, you can Aftershock it. If they play a Misfortune, you can Aftershock it. If they play an Ezreal, you can Aftershock it. Like it just turns out that Aftershock is just like a universally kind of okay card right now for P and Z. It's again meta dependent. The less landmarks, the worse it is. But there's enough landmarks that I would just run the Aftershock, the hardcore answer in most cases over the Pioneer. The reason why Pioneer is so good in Eddy is because you can usually buff his stats by endgame, so it's like never a dead card. But yeah, usually you run the Aftershock in Jace Lux. Especially because we have things like Forge of Tomorrow, right? So Forge of Tomorrow, when you cast, it basically summons a 3/3 for 3, which is already great, and then it gives you a landmark that says when you cast a 6-mana spell, destroy me and refill your spell mana. So a lot of attuned tempo, like usually Jace Lux is just too slow to be good. It's one of the things I find with the deck, and it's why it loses a lot. Forge of Tomorrow entirely fixes that. You get your 3/3 body, you get your landmark that is going to essentially pay for itself after it's done. This is old Jace Lux tech. A lot of Jace Lux decks went faster. They just wanted faster and more tempo, and they cut Forge of Tomorrow because it's not a good tempo card. It's a great control card for Jace Lux. And so you can see that we're moving away from the tempo. We're moving more towards that mid-rangey control spectrum. Jace, of course, you've got your Challenger on 4. You just usually play Jace with Challenger, and then you drag something, good mid-range card. And then Mage Seeker and Igniter, being a 6/6, I actually find this is pretty good. If you're facing an Eddy deck, and they play their 6-mana Cloud Drake, and it's like a 6/6 with Challenger, you can just play Mage Seeker Igniter into their Cloud Drake and actually trade even with it. So, and even if it's bigger than a 6/6, usually that means you're setting it up for like a, you're setting it into, not Hexobliterator range, sorry, you're setting into like Shock Blast range. You're basically setting up for like a future Shock Blast or just like a Mystic Shot removal or an Aftershock. Like, it's okay. It's just like, this deck needs a little bit of beef. Again, we're doing the mid-range Lux thing, and I'm finding that the mid-range Lux thing is doing better. Formula, you need the draw. The fact that Jace Lux is not running the draw is just like, again, they're not confident enough in the Jace Lux win con. I'm very confident in Jace Lux in terms of just like, I will slam my Jace, I will slam my Lux, and then I'll just win con out, and then the other person will concede. And like that will usually happen. And I'm teched enough into tempo and anti-tempo that I know that I can just like play solitaire into them with Forge of Tomorrow, and they're just not going to be able to do anything. Because this is the whole thing I talk about a lot on this channel, is that like, Eternal is a very complex format where, like, yes, you have tempo decks, yes, you have anti-tempo decks, yes, you have aggro decks, you have combo decks, you have control decks, you have, champ-focused decks, you have follower-focused decks, you have win-con-focused decks, you have non-win-con-focused decks. All these things are massively different. So the great thing is that if everyone's running infinite cycle garbage that doesn't do anything, you can feel free to just like win con out. Like just play your Jace, they have no hard removal. Play your Lux, they have no hard removal. They also have no strikes. Worst they can do is bounce it. Just keep playing it. And then eventually you're going to win con out. And that's kind of the great thing. Hexobliterator, mandatory 3 of. You need to hit that 6-mana damage mark sometimes. And then obviously Shock Blast is your burn win con. Usually Jace Lux is now on 3 Pharoses just for the cycle and also the burn win con. So usually you just run the 3 Pharoses these days. It's just like how Swain usually runs 3 Leviathans, you just run 3 Pharoses. It's just you run the 3 boats, and they're just universally good. And then I have the 1 True Shot Barrage, which is kind of like a cheeky card, a cheeky one of that's kind of nice. But yeah. The only thing that I would argue that is not necessarily absolutely perfect about this deck might be the Aftershock, but like I'm confident enough in that as a tech decision that I'm fine with it. Remove cheap champions, stuff like, you know, Lux Illuminated, Caitlyn, Ezreal, a lot of these sort of snowbally cheap champions. Remove that for 3 mana, or remove a landmark. I'm fine with it. Or potentially just throw it into something to set up for, you know, a Shock Blast or whatever. You're 2 for 1. So that's typically how you play proactively in the Eternal format. Like, that's a thing that I see a lot of people struggle with. That it's like, if it's either I'm tempo or I'm anti-tempo, and there's no in between. Like, they just don't really understand how to do anything other than that. It's either that I am the Azir Aurelia player and I'm tempoing as fast as I can and as hard as I can, or I'm the Eddie player, or I'm the anti-tempo control player and I'm playing tempo and I'm infinitely cycling out and I'm doing nothing. So I'm either all in on doing something, or I'm either doing nothing. And there's very little in between in terms of like LOR professional play, which is very strange because, again, in Eternal there's a lot of like mid-range play that people kind of forget about. So, for example, I went into a Rise mirror, and then, you know, the Rise player is just like, oh, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And I'm just like, I'm just going to play Solitaire with my landmarks and play more landmarks than you, and then I win. And that's what I did. Like, there was very little decision-making process on my part beyond just, like, I know what my win con is, and I know how to win with this deck, even into a mirror, even into an anti-tempo situation, even into a control situation, even into, you know, potentially an aggro situation. The only thing that I would lose would be, like, the all-in Azir Aurelia, which, again, we're not seeing right now in the Eternal meta, because everyone's just so afraid of tempo that they're 100% anti-tempo. So yeah, you know, Jace Lux, Rise, I would argue the correct way, you know, there are correct ways to play something like Yasuo, or even like a Kindred mid-range, right? You know, with your Death Grasps and your Hate Spikes and your Glares and your Crumbles. Like, I'm in 3 in on Crumble on my old school Kindred Evelyn kind of meme deck. 3 Vengeances, like a lot of hard removal, a lot of hard answers to things. Because I'm just confident that I can kind of win con out faster than them, because I know how to play these decks. I know how to play for champions, right? And sometimes, you know, Swim would call it just running your best line, right? It's like, if you play a mid-range deck, the biggest difference between a good mid-range player and a bad mid-range player is knowing when to go from controlling to simply winning. Like, you have to know when to flip that switch where, like, okay, I'm anti-tempo for about half the game, and then I'm tempo for about half the game. I've flicked that switch. Like, I know I have to win before, at this exact pivotal moment. And if you can't do that, you're not very good at traditional LOR. Like, old school legacy LOR, you're not very good at that if you can't play, like, Mogwai mid-range. You know, he popularized mid-range quite a bit in this card game. If you can't do that, if you can't play Mogwai mid-range and flip that switch, you're really going to struggle in LOR against players who have been playing this game a very long time, because they can do that, right? They can go from, like, I know what your deck is doing, that it's two-dimensional and easy to deal with, and then I know what that other deck is doing that's two-dimensional and easy to deal with. You have to kind of play them on the same footing. So, like, what are other good, like, archetypal mid-range decks? You know, you have stuff like Elusive Spam, right? Like, Elusive Spam with all-in Burst. So, like, you don't see much Burst win con stuff right now in Eternal. That's also, like, old school Swim tech is like elusives with, like, Blessing of Targon and Battle Bonds. You don't see much of that right now, and that's a bit of a mistake. I think there's, like, a really big place for any sort of burst win con to kind of break out and do very, very well. So it could be, for example, Noxus Might decks. They're very popular. They were popular in the history of LOR. You're not seeing them right now, which is kind of what I'm drawing attention to, is that, like, just play like a Rumble with Might. That could be really, really good, right? You just give your Rumble Overwhelm and then swing into the Nexus, and it has Spell Shield, and that's going to be pretty good. Another classic mid-range style deck would be something like Auction Sivir. So Auction Sivir, essentially, you know, Sivir has Spell Shield, and it's like a Spell Shield tribal kind of deck. Sivir plus the 5 mana Overwhelm with Spell Shield, etc., etc. Ruin Runner. So a lot of this stuff right now is kind of getting forgotten. It's just like, you're looking at the way people are building decks right now, the people who are still left playing LOR as a game and perhaps aren't as familiar with legacy LOR, they've kind of just forgotten about how mid-range works in this game. Which is fair, because it is tough, because you have to flick that switch in your brain. But yeah, absolutely, don't forget about mid-range. Or, for example, here's a great sort of interesting shell for a burn deck, right? It used to have these sort of like Shadow Isles P and Z decks, and then they would have to sort of switch between the aggro game plan to the burn you out game plan, and with like, you know, Cask Salesman and then Phantom Prankster, etc. I'm not saying that you should necessarily play any of these decks. I'm just saying that they were decks that have traditionally done well in the past of Eternal and in LOR history. So again, burn, kind of that burn, aggro, burn mid-range, elusive spam, all-in rumble, right? All-in rumble, usually with the 3 mites, all-in Sivir, right? So like this type of stuff where you do kind of flick that switch and change the way that you're playing the game. Riven, LeBlanc, Echo, right? Combo Echo. But no, it really is just like tempo or anti-tempo in Eternal. And that's great because if you know how to play these decks that can switch gears, you're going to do very, very well. So yeah, Jace Lux, where you're willing to just throw shock blasts into face, like just do it. Like as Nike says, you're not the control deck. If you're Jace Lux into like ramp or temple or whatever, you're not the control deck. You're the mid-range deck. You gotta like actually remove things and hit HP over and over again and keep hitting Nexus, and then basically bank on them not having any healing because they very rarely do. And then if you're the Rise deck, you need to be essentially comboing out with your landmarks faster than your opponent for your combo win con. All this stuff, right? All this stuff, absolutely. If you were to build something like Heal OTK or Bandle City or Bandle Tree, right? You're playing Bandle Tree or you're playing Fountain. You need to be understanding that you have to win the game sometimes without having the opponent's creatures to essentially win con off of, right? So you're not like really caring sometimes when you play Star Springs that the opponent has creatures. Sometimes you have to win with Star Springs with the opponent not having any creatures for you to damage your own stuff off of. In that case, you need to run enough self-damaging units to kind of be able to do that, which a lot of Star Spring players don't. They don't play for the combo. They play for the, sort of mid-range, slow roll value package. I don't know what they really do. Like most Star Spring players confuse me because they don't seem to know how to play Star Springs, but there are a lot of self-damage units in Bilgewater, and so you should potentially be able to win off of Star Springs without any interaction from your opponent whatsoever. And like that's how I play Rise as well. Is like, yes, if you're playing tempo, I can deal with that absolutely very easily. But if you're playing anti-tempo and you're not doing anything, I still have to have a path to victory with my combo deck. Otherwise, it's not worth playing. Another thing that I think could be really, really strong right now would be Fiora. Right, so if you're playing into a lot of anti-tempo situations, right, Fiora is very good at just strike spamming and then OTKing the opponent off of the Fiora. And so I have a lot of respect for dedicated Fiora players because that's probably one of the hardest, least consistent decks you can play in like LOR history, in my opinion. Like it's just very, very challenging to play Fiora. But Fiora is very good. I would say Fiora right now into all this temple creature spam nonsense, probably decent, probably pretty decent. And then, you know, if you're wondering what Standard looks like right now, like Standard's not really worth talking about because Standard is always just like Gwen, right? Like you look at every season of Standard and it's basically just Gwen. Whatever the best like aggro tempo deck is in Standard is the best deck in Standard, like just whatever that is. And a lot of the time it is Gwen because Gwen is just really good in the Standard format in terms of what she does. So again, I don't talk about Standard a lot. Illoy, right? Like, I think Illoy would be a great card to play right now because a lot of people aren't in on the Hexpliterators. They aren't in on the Vengeances. They might be in on a bounce of some kind, but probably not enough bounces to be consistent. So like you could just like, Illoy's like archetypal mid-range that would do very, very well right now. Probably don't play Lurk. I tried Lurk. Lurk's not great. Again, don't play aggro. Don't play Azir Aurelia. Don't play tempo because every deck is anti-tempo. And don't play, you can basically play control or you can play mid-range and then just feast on either side of the equation. And that's about where the meta is right now. Play Pantheon, right? Like you could absolutely just, if you're running an optimal Pantheon deck and you just combo out with Pantheon and you get Spell Shield, like there's nothing the opponent can do in these sorts of do nothing, cycle anti-tempo decks. Basically like your Ezreal, stuff that we talked about yesterday. Nidalee, right? You could probably do okay with Nidalee. You could probably do okay with Sundisk, Renekton. It's just a lot of this sort of mid-rangey stuff. Shen, right? Shen's okay. Tahm Kench is okay. Shyvana's going to be okay. Yeah. If you wanted to run Veigar, like make sure you're on the Explore card so you can remove their Temple. I would say that this is a great time for mid-range and dedicated control decks. Not just tempo decks and anti-tempo. I would say explore, the other two pillars of deck building, and I think you're going to do very, very well right now, because once I start, actually targeting those matchups, the tempo or anti-tempo, there's basically nothing anybody can do into me. And again, I know that nobody's left playing LOR that hasn't been playing for ages, so these are all Masters levels players that I'm just like feasting on, like auto winning into. And typically what I'll do is I'll play a game or two each morning on my phone, and then I'll just auto-concede those games until I get a sense of what people are playing, and then I'll just go in on my PC and just like run the table once I'm kind of playing it seriously, and then there's nothing they can do. Unless they start, diversifying what they're playing as well, which they can do, right? Like run a Yasuo deck, run a Kindred deck out of nowhere, run an Undyr deck out of nowhere. Like you never know, it might take. Run a Poro King deck, Poro King is like archetypal mid-range. Just fill the board up with random junk and make it bigger over time. It's not tempo, it's not anti-tempo, it's somewhere in the middle, right? Optimal Poro King. It has a lot of like value over time, and then winning later in the game. So it's like archetypal mid-range is like your standard Poro King stuff. Elites, right? Elites can be problematic. It's just all of these things. You want to keep them in mind. Absolutely. That's it for Eternal King today. Again, really happy with where Eternal as a format, is right now. It has great tempo decks, it has great anti-tempo decks, and then the players who are either trying to play control or mid-range don't really know how to do it properly, and then you're just feasting on them. That's it for today. This is Eternal King, signing out.